Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified,
Mm.
where we like to introduce legal concepts, in the simplest way possible.
Exact.
So today we are diving deep into something pretty crucial,
Yeah,
the cornerstone of international refugee law,
absolutely.
which is the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees from 1951 and its 1967 protocol.
Big one.
Yeah, so we've got a whole stack of articles and case studies to unpack
Mm-hmm.
for you guys today. So think of this as your shortcut
Yeah.
to understanding how refugees are defined and protected under international law.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how these documents drafted decades ago still shape the global conversation
I know, it's crazy.
on refugee protection. And we'll get into some surprising examples, too, of how different countries have interpreted the convention.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to kick us off with a case that I was reading about.
Okay.
It's called Toyota v. New Zealand. Have you heard of this one?
Yes, familiar with that one.
So this was a man who claimed that rising sea levels forced him to flee his home.
Right.
And the courts ultimately didn't grant him refugee status.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me wonder, how does the convention actually define a refugee?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the Toyota case is a perfect example of how real-world events push us to re-examine these legal definitions.
Yeah.
The convention really centers on this idea of persecution.
Okay.
So a refugee, according to the convention, is someone outside their country of origin with a well-founded fear of persecution
Cool.
based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion.
So it's not just fleeing any danger.
Right.
It has to be like you are being targeted for a very specific reason.
Exactly. It's about that threat of being targeted for those reasons.
Yeah, and I guess that's why the Toyota case has such a hard time, because climate change, while a serious threat,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't fit neatly into persecution.
You got it. It does. And, the convention was drafted in the aftermath of World War II.
Right.
So it was very much focused on individual persecution as it was understood at that time.
Right.
And while it guarantees certain rights to those recognized as refugees, like access to courts, education, employment.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was reading through it,
Yeah.
that they weren't absolute.
They're not absolute. These rights are not absolute. And there are qualifications and limitations.
Which makes sense because countries have to balance protecting refugees with managing their own resources.
For sure. That's a key tension that runs throughout the convention.
Yeah.
It tries to strike this balance between protecting individuals fleeing persecution, but also respecting the sovereignty of states.
And speaking of states, I found it super interesting how countries can make reservations to the convention.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a global agreement,
Yeah.
but then they can essentially say, we're signing on, but with these very specific exceptions.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Reservations are a way for states to kind of customize the convention's application based on their own domestic context.
Okay.
So, one example is Angola.
Okay.
They've stated that the convention's provisions cannot supersede its own national laws.
So if Angola's national law clashes with the convention, Angola's law wins out.
It creates a really complex situation.
Yeah.
Essentially, a refugee's rights in Angola could be limited by national legislation, potentially creating conflict with the convention's core principles.
That's wild.
Yeah,
It really highlights how the implementation of these international agreements can be so different.
absolutely.
I saw another example with Denmark and their reservation regarding employment privileges for refugees.
Yeah, every country kind of navigates the convention in its own way.
Yeah.
And so Denmark's reservation means they might not offer refugees the same level of access to employment
Right.
as other countries that have fully adopted the convention's provisions on that.
It makes you realize how much is at stake when we talk about legal frameworks like this.
Absolutely.
It's not just words on paper. It's actually affecting people's lives and opportunities.
Couldn't agree more. And that's why, understanding the nuances of the convention and how it's applied
Right.
is so crucial.
Okay, so we've talked about the 1951 convention,
Right.
but what about the 1967 protocol?
Yeah.
Why was that needed?
So the 1951 convention was groundbreaking, but it was also very much a product of its time.
Okay.
Drafted with a very specific historical context in mind, which was the massive displacement in Europe following World War II.
So the initial focus was on Europe and events that happened before 1951.
Exactly. The 1951 convention initially only applied to people who became refugees before January 1st, 1951, and primarily to those in Europe.
Okay.
The 67 protocol changed that.
So the protocol basically broadened the scope.
Yeah.
like recognizing that the refugee issue wasn't just a European thing.
Precisely, it removed those time and geographic
Oh,
restrictions.
well.
So now refugee protection applies worldwide, regardless of when someone became displaced.
Which makes sense because the world didn't stop having refugee crises after 1951.
Right, and it highlights how international law can adapt to evolving global situations. The protocol was a direct response to these changing realities of displacement, and it ensured that the 1951 Convention's protections became truly universal.
And that brings us to something that I think is so important,
Okay.
which is the principle of non-refoulement.
Yes.
It's enshrined in Article 33 of the Convention. And from what I understand, it's basically like the safeguard against sending refugees back to danger.
Yeah, you got a wit. Non-refoulement is a cornerstone of refugee protection. It prohibits states from returning a refugee to a country where their life or freedom would be threatened.
So it seems like such a fundamental right
Absolutely.
that people fleeing persecution shouldn't be sent back to more harm.
You would think so, but are there ever exceptions to this?
Yeah, I was going to ask, are there situations where a refugee might still be returned?
That's where things get really interesting, and it's a key area of discussion for law students.
Okay.
So while non-refoulement is this fundamental principle, the Convention does allow for exceptions,
Okay.
albeit very limited ones.
So are there circumstances where a state's security concerns might override that non-refoulement principle?
Potentially, yes.
Wow. That must be so tough to navigate legally.
It is. One example is if a refugee is deemed a danger to national security
Okay.
or has been convicted of a serious crime.
Right.
So these exceptions raise really complex legal questions about the balance between protecting refugees and safeguarding national security.
It really just shows that applying international law is rarely straightforward.
It's not black and white.
There are always these competing interests and difficult decisions that have to be made.
Exactly, and understanding those complexities is key to grasping how refugee law operates in the real world.
Yeah.
It's not just about these abstract principles. It's about how those principles play out in specific cases in context.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the rights of refugees.
Yeah.
But what about the responsibilities? Does
Yeah.
the convention address that too?
It does. The convention isn't solely about granting rights. It also emphasizes the obligations that refugees have to their host countries.
So it's like recognizing that being granted asylum also comes with some responsibility.
Precisely. It's a reciprocal relationship.
Okay.
The convention outlines both the protections afforded to refugees, but also the expectations placed upon them.
Okay.
One key responsibility is this requirement to abide by the host country's national laws and regulations.
So while they're seeking refuge and protection, they also have to respect the laws of the country offering them that safe haven.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, between protecting individual rights, but also maintaining the rule of law within the host country.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The definition of a refugee, the rights they're afforded, the principle of non-refoulement, the responsibilities they hold.
It's a lot.
But let me ask you straight up, is the convention perfect? I mean, this was drafted over 70 years ago.
Right.
Does it hold up in today's world?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that legal scholars and policymakers are grappling with constantly.
Yeah.
The 1951 Convention, while a landmark achievement, has faced its fair share of criticism.
What are some of the main criticisms?
Well,
People think it's too narrow in its definition of who qualifies for refugee status.
yeah, that's a major point of contention.
Okay.
The convention's focus on individual persecution based on those 5 grounds:
Right.
race, religion, nationality, social group, political opinion, it might not fully capture the complex realities of displacement today.
Like we saw with that Taichioda case.
Exactly.
Climate change-induced displacement, it just doesn't fit neatly into that definition.
And there's an ongoing debate about whether the convention adequately addresses things like gender-based persecution or other forms of harm that might not fall under those traditional 5 grounds. Some argue that it needs updating or reinterpretation to be more inclusive.
So while it's the bedrock of international refugee law, the 1951 Convention, it's not without its flaws.
That's right. It's important to recognize both its enduring significance, but also its limitations.
Yeah.
It provides this crucial framework, but there's always room for discussion about how to adapt and evolve its application in a changing world.
Right.
It's a very dynamic area of law, and engaging with these complexities is crucial for anyone, studying or working in this field.
And that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Absolutely.
It's not just about memorizing legal texts. It's about grappling with real-world problems and considering how the law can evolve to address them.
You got it. And the 1951 convention, with its history and ongoing relevance, provides a perfect case study for that kind of engagement.
Yeah.
It's a living document, constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted in light of new challenges.
I love that, a living document.
Yeah. And that's why I find this debate around the convention's relevance in the 21st century so interesting. You have some arguing it's outdated, unable to really address modern challenges.
Yeah, I was reading some articles on that, like pointing to climate-induced displacement as an example.
Right.
It just doesn't fit neatly into that persecution model
It doesn't.
that the convention was built on.
Exactly. And then there's the question of whether it adequately covers things like gender-based violence, which wasn't explicitly addressed back in 1951.
Right.
So some scholars argue for amendments, others for broader interpretations.
It seems like such a tough balance to strike.
He is.
Updating it to reflect today's realities, but also potentially undermining that universality if you can't get global agreement on the changes.
Yeah, that's the risk, right? And then there's the argument that the convention has already been supplemented by regional instruments and international human rights law, kind of filling in some of those gaps.
It makes you wonder, though, if just adding more legal layers is always the best answer.
Yeah.
Does it become harder to navigate and enforce if you have all these different, sometimes overlapping frameworks?
It's a valid concern, and it highlights the need for not just legal framework, but also effective implementation and coordination among all these different actors.
And speaking of implementation, I was reading about how the U.S. approach to the convention has been, well, a bit complicated.
Yeah, a little bit.
They were so instrumental in drafting it.
They were.
But didn't actually ratify it until 1968.
Yeah, the U.S. relationship with the convention has been unique, to say the least.
Yeah.
Cold War politics, concerns about national security, potential conflicts with existing immigration laws.
Right.
All played a role in that delayed ratification.
And even after ratifying, they made several reservations.
They did.
Didn't that impact how the convention is actually applied within the U.S.?
Absolutely. One significant reservation was regarding Article 31, which deals with penalties for illegal entry.
Right.
So the U.S. reservation essentially allowed them to continue prosecuting asylum seekers for entering illegally.
Wow.
Even if they were fleeing persecution.
That seems like a pretty big departure from the convention's core principle.
It was, and it sparked ongoing debates and legal challenges.
Yep.
The U.S. has made other reservations as well, like those related to labor rights and Social Security provisions for refugees.
It's a prime example of how even when a country ratifies the convention, its application on the ground can be shaped by domestic politics and legal interpretations.
Absolutely.
So you have this overarching framework, but the reality for a refugee can vary drastically.
It does.
Depending on where they seek asylum.
For sure. And that's why understanding both the broad principles of the convention and the specific ways it's implemented in different contexts is so crucial, especially for law students.
Right.
You need that global and local perspective to really grasp how refugee law works.
Okay, before we move on, I want to make sure we're clear on a term we've been using, which is asylum.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean?
Right.
And how does it relate to the convention?
So asylum is essentially the protection that a state grants to someone fleeing persecution. It's this concrete act of humanitarian protection recognizing the individual's right to seek safety. And the 1951 Convention provides the legal framework for asylum, defining who qualifies for refugee status and what rights they have in the country granting them asylum.
So while individual countries might have their own procedures for handling asylum claims, the convention sets the international standards that they're supposed to follow.
Exactly. Think of it as the foundation upon which each country then builds its own specific system. And that's where the distinction between refugee and asylum seeker becomes important.
I've always been a bit fuzzy on that.
Yeah.
Seems like those terms get used interchangeably sometimes.
They do, and the difference really lies in the stage of the legal process. So an asylum seeker is someone who has formally applied for asylum. But their claim hasn't been assessed yet.
Got it.
So they're seeking recognition as a refugee.
So they're kind of in limbo, waiting to find out if they'll be granted that protected status.
Exactly. Once their claim is recognized, then they are officially granted refugee status. And become a refugee under international law, and that status then comes with certain rights and protections.
So asylum seeker is like the waiting room.
Yeah.
And then refugee means you've been granted entry.
I love that analogy.
Okay, good.
And During that waiting period, the level of rights and assistance that an asylum seeker receives can vary greatly.
Okay.
Depending on the country and its specific laws, some countries are much more generous than others.
That makes me think about integration.
Yeah.
Someone is granted asylum. How do they actually rebuild their lives?
Right.
What are some of the challenges they face coming to this new country?
Integration is a multifaceted process.
Yeah.
It encompasses everything from learning the language and finding a job to accessing healthcare and education.
Right.
And it can be incredibly daunting, especially for those who have experienced trauma and displacement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They might arrive with limited resources they have to navigate unfamiliar systems, potentially face discrimination.
Yeah.
It's more than just providing basic necessities.
It is.
It's about creating an environment where they can truly thrive.
Exactly. And successful integration really requires effort from both sides.
Okay.
So refugees need to be open to learning and adapting, and the host country needs to create supportive policies and combat discrimination.
It sounds like a really complex dance between individual resilience and societal structures that can either help or hinder that integration.
That's a great way to put it. And when it works, the benefits are immense, both for the refugee and the host country.
So we've been talking about this legal framework and these concepts,
Mm-hmm.
but we're living through a time of unprecedented displacement, right?
Right.
This isn't just theory. We're talking about millions of people fleeing conflict and persecution.
You're absolutely right. The current refugee crisis is pushing the global system to its limits.
Yeah.
The UNHCR reported over 110 million forcibly displaced people worldwide at the end of 2023.
110 million.
That's the highest number ever recorded.
That's almost impossible to grasp.
It is.
It really puts this whole conversation into perspective.
It does. And think about it this way. That's roughly the population of Germany.
Wow.
And it reflects the ongoing conflicts, violence, and human rights violations happening around the world.
And that's just those who've crossed international borders.
Exactly.
The number internally displaced is probably much higher.
Likely much higher, yeah.
So with this massive crisis and a convention that was drafted over 70 years ago, how is the international community actually responding?
Right.
Is the convention still the go-to framework?
I'd say it remains the foundation.
Okay.
But as we discussed, its limitations are becoming increasingly apparent.
Right.
So while those core principles still guide the response, the sheer scale and complexity of the current crisis has forced the international community to explore some new approaches.
What are some of those new approaches?
Yeah.
How are they adapting to this kind of evolving landscape of displacement?
One major shift has been this increasing focus on regional responses. So organizations like the EU and the African Union are taking a more prominent role in managing refugee flows and providing protection within their regions.
So it's about recognizing that different regions might have unique needs and challenges when it comes to displacement.
Exactly.
And that a one-size-fits-all approach might not be the most effective.
Exactly. Regional cooperation can be much more efficient in coordinating responses, sharing resources, and finding lasting solutions for refugees.
Okay, regional cooperation makes sense. What other strategies are being used to tackle this global refugee crisis?
Another trend is this growing emphasis on burden sharing among states.
Okay.
The current crisis has put a disproportionate strain on certain countries, often those bordering conflict zones, or those with more generous asylum policies.
Yeah, it seems inevitable that some countries would end up shouldering a much heavier burden than others,
They do.
just based on geography or their existing policies.
Right, and that's why there's increasing pressure for wealthier nations to step up. We're talking about providing financial assistance to countries hosting large refugee populations and also resettling refugees within their own borders.
So spreading the responsibility more equitably.
Exactly.
But is that actually happening? Are there any examples of successful burden-sharing initiatives?
One example is the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, or CRRF.
Okay.
It was endorsed by the UN General Assembly back in 2016, and it encourages this more holistic approach involving host countries, donor countries, humanitarian organizations, development agencies, and refugees themselves.
Is it about moving beyond a purely humanitarian response and thinking about long-term development and self-reliance for refugees?
You got it.
But does it actually work?
It's still relatively new, but the CRRF has shown promise.
Okay.
Uganda, for example, has been praised for its progressive refugee policies and its efforts to integrate refugees into local communities.
So while it's too early to say definitively, it seems like a step in the right direction.
I think so.
It's about bringing more structure and accountability to that responsibility sharing process.
Exactly. It's a shift away from simply reacting to crises and toward a more sustainable, development-oriented model for refugee response.
So we've been focusing on states and international organizations.
Yeah.
But what about private actors?
Right.
What role do businesses, NGOs, and individuals play in responding to this crisis?
Their role is becoming increasingly important. They bring valuable resources, expertise, and innovation to the table, complementing the efforts of governments and international organizations.
Okay, let's break that down. What are some specific examples of how private actors are contributing?
Sure, so businesses are getting involved in various ways. Some offer job training and employment opportunities to refugees, recognizing the skills and talents they bring.
Mm-hmm.
Others invest in social enterprises that support refugee livelihoods or develop products and services tailored to their needs.
So it's about seeing refugees not just as beneficiaries of aid,
Right.
but as potential employees, entrepreneurs, consumers,
Exactly.
empowering them economically.
Yeah. Exactly. NGOs are also critical players.
Yeah.
They provide humanitarian assistance,
Mm.
legal aid education, healthcare, psychosocial support.
They must be vital, especially given the limited resources of many international organizations
They are.
and the political constraints that some governments face.
Absolutely. And then you have individuals who contribute in countless ways.
Yeah.
Volunteering, donating to organizations, advocating for policy changes. All of these actions make a difference.
It's really a collective effort
It is.
involving actors from every level of society,
It takes a village.
but with all the challenges involved. So
Yeah.
are you ever pessimistic about the future of refugee protection?
Honestly, the sheer scale of the challenges can feel overwhelming at times.
Yeah.
The conflicts seem endless, political will is often lacking, and resources are always stretched thin.
I can see how that would be discouraging.
Yeah, but then I see the incredible resilience of refugees.
Right.
The tireless work of humanitarian organizations and the growing compassion among individuals around the world. And that gives me hope. It's about finding those glimmers of hope amidst the darkness.
And believing that even small acts of kindness and solidarity can make a difference.
Absolutely. This is a human-made problem, and it demands human-led solutions.
Right.
It's up to all of us to demand better from our leaders, support those working on the ground, and challenge narratives that dehumanize refugees.
Well said. We've talked a lot about the challenges.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that refugees are not just victims.
No, they're not.
They're individuals with stories, skills, aspirations.
Exactly. They possess incredible resilience, creativity, and determination to rebuild their lives. And they bring diverse perspectives, experiences, and talents to their new communities.
Like Albert Einstein,
Exactly.
who fled Nazi Germany and revolutionized physics.
A perfect example.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder of the potential that often resides within refugee populations.
Absolutely.
It's about shifting that narrative, seeing them not as a burden, but as valuable members of society.
Couldn't agree more. Promoting integration, empowering refugees, and celebrating their contributions, that's where we need to focus our efforts.
Okay, as we start to wrap up this discussion on the global refugee crisis, I have one final question.
Okay.
Given the scale of the crisis, the limitations of the convention, and the complexities of international cooperation, are you ultimately optimistic about the future of refugee protection?
That's a tough one to answer. It's complex. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by just the sheer scale of the challenges. The conflicts seem endless, the political will is often so fleeting, and resources are always stretched thin.
Yeah, I get that. I can definitely see how those factors would kind of weigh on anyone who's, trying to address this crisis.
But on the other hand, witnessing that incredible resilience of refugees, the dedication of everyone working to protect them, and that growing global awareness of the issue, I think it does give me reason for optimism.
Yeah, it's about finding those points of light amidst all that, amidst all the darkness, believing that change is actually possible.
Exactly. We need to remember that this is a human-made problem, which means that it can be solved with human effort. It starts with each of us demanding more from our leaders, supporting those who are working on the ground, and challenging those narratives that dehumanize refugees.
Well said. And speaking of challenging narratives, I've been reading about the increasing recognition of refugee-led initiatives.
Yes.
And it makes sense that those with lived experience would be the ones best equipped to really understand the needs and challenges.
Absolutely. Refugee-led organizations are playing such a vital role. They're advocating for policy changes. They're providing essential services and fostering that community resilience.
Yeah.
They bring a depth of understanding and commitment that's just invaluable.
It's about empowering refugees to be agents of change, not just passive recipients of aid.
Yes.
Have you seen this shift towards refugee-led solutions gaining traction within the international community?
I have definitely, there's a growing recognition that, supporting and amplifying the voices of refugees is not just ethical, it's also strategically smart.
Right.
Their insights are crucial for developing those effective and sustainable solutions.
It seems like that would also help to counter some of the negative stereotypes and misconceptions that surround refugees.
For sure, by showcasing, their leadership, their resilience, their contributions,
Mm,
we can change perceptions and foster more welcoming and inclusive environments.
absolutely. Okay, I want to shift gears a bit
Sure.
and talk about something I've seen referred to as durable solutions.
Okay.
What exactly does that mean in the context of refugee protection?
So, durable solutions are essentially those long-term pathways for refugees to rebuild their lives
Okay.
in safety and dignity. And the 1951 Convention outlines three primary solutions:
Okay.
voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement to a third country.
Okay, let's break those down.
Okay.
First, voluntary repatriation. What does that entail?
So it's the process of refugees choosing to return to their home country once it's safe to do so.
Okay.
It often involves political stabilization, peace-building efforts, and addressing those root causes of displacement.
So it's not just about ending the conflict.
It's a
It's
mess.
about creating conditions where those who return can actually build a sustainable future.
Exactly. And it must always be voluntary.
Okay.
Refugees should never be forced or coerced into returning to a place where they might still be in danger.
That's a fundamental point.
It is.
It's about agency and choice for people who have already been through so much.
Mhm.
Okay, what about local integration?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
So local integration is about helping refugees build new lives in the country where they've been granted asylum.
Right.
It involves providing things like language training, job opportunities, access to education and healthcare, and pathways to citizenship.
So it's about creating that path for them to become, full members of that community,
Yeah,
contributing to society.
exactly. But it's a two-way street. It requires commitment from both the refugee and the host country. So refugees need to be open to learning and adapting, and the host country needs to create policies that facilitate integration and combat discrimination.
It sounds like a process that requires a lot of mutual understanding and effort.
It does,
Yeah.
but when it works, the benefits are so significant for both sides.
Yeah.
It can lead to greater social cohesion, economic growth, and cultural enrichment.
Okay, now what about the third solution? You mentioned resettlement to a third country.
Right.
When does that come into play?
So resettlement is typically a last resort.
Right.
It's reserved for the most vulnerable refugees,
Okay.
like those with severe medical needs, survivors of torture, or those facing continued threats, even in their first country of asylum.
Right.
So it involves transferring them to a third country that has agreed to grant them permanent residence.
So it's a lifeline for those who've kind of exhausted all of their options and are still in a really precarious situation.
Precisely, and it's a complex process, involving coordination between multiple countries and organizations, but it can be transformative for the refugees that are fortunate enough to be resettled.
It really highlights the need for global cooperation
Yes,
and a shared sense of responsibility for those fleeing persecution.
absolutely.
Are there other solutions being explored beyond these three main categories?
There's been growing interest in what are called complementary pathways,
Okay.
which provide safe and legal alternatives to irregular migration for refugees.
So instead of relying on these dangerous journeys and smugglers,
Right.
they would have more options for reaching safety legally.
Exactly what kinds of pathways are we talking about? Things like student visas, work permits, family reunification programs, humanitarian visas.
Yeah.
These pathways allow refugees to rebuild their lives while also benefiting the receiving countries, addressing labor shortages, boosting economies, increasing diversity.
It's about promoting both humanitarian goals and economic development.
You got it. Everybody wins.
Yeah. What other innovative solutions are kind of gaining traction?
Well, there's also the concept of humanitarian corridors.
Okay.
So these are safe and legal routes that are established by states and humanitarian organizations to evacuate refugees from immediate danger zones.
It's like a direct lifeline for those trapped in such desperate situations.
Exactly. It allows for safe passage, avoids the risks associated with irregular migration, and upholds those principles of humanity and international solidarity.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see these new solutions being developed.
It is.
But we can't forget about the human cost of this crisis.
Right.
I've been thinking a lot about the mental health challenges faced by those fleeing violence and persecution.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about physical safety, it's also about addressing that psychological trauma.
You're absolutely right. Refugees are exposed to multiple traumas both in their home countries and during their journeys. They may witness violence, experience torture, lose loved ones, or face ongoing threats.
Right.
And these experiences can lead to PTSD, anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues.
So it's crucial to address these invisible wounds,
It is.
to provide support that goes beyond just those basic needs.
Absolutely. And that means ensuring access to mental health professionals who are culturally sensitive and aware of language barriers.
Yeah.
Community-based support networks are also really vital,
Yeah.
providing safe spaces for refugees to share their experiences and connect with others.
It's about fostering that sense of belonging and reducing the isolation they may feel.
Exactly. It's holistic care that takes into account the interconnectedness of mental, emotional, and social well-being.
Right. It's not just one thing.
Yeah.
It's all of it together.
Exactly. Integrating mental health support into all aspects of refugee protection,
Mm.
from asylum procedures to integration programs, is essential for truly helping them rebuild their lives.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful discussion.
Yes.
We've explored the legal frameworks, the global challenges, the innovative solutions, and the human impact of this refugee crisis.
Yeah, it's been a privilege to delve into these complexities with you. Hopefully our listeners now have a greater understanding of, the nuances of international refugee law and those multifaceted challenges faced by refugees.
I want to leave our listeners with this thought.
Okay.
The global refugee crisis, it's not someone else's problem.
It's not.
It demands our attention, our empathy, and our action.
I agree.
Whether it's through volunteering, donating, advocating for policy changes, or simply educating ourselves and engaging in respectful dialogue, we can all contribute to creating a more just and compassionate world.
I wholeheartedly agree. Every act of kindness, solidarity, and advocacy, it ripples outward, creating a more humane and welcoming world for refugees.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into international refugee law and the global refugee crisis. We hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more and take action.
It's been an honor sharing this journey with you.
This concludes this episode of LexTalks Legal Topics, Simplified. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different area of law.
Until then, stay curious and engaged.
And remember, building a more just and compassionate world starts with each of us.